Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me for yet another space. The space will be the first of three. These three spaces will, first of all, do a year-end review, and also will start the movement for the same kind of thread that I did last year in January. So it's going to be a prelude for a predictive thread. The main issue when it comes to the first part of this triptych of information is that for once in this war, since roughly July 2022, Russia has all the cards in hand right now to win the war militarily, but in a completely different view than what we had in July 2022. If you remember, in July 2022, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk had fallen, and slowly the maneuver was preparing for a consolidation in Kherson right bank and a consolidation of the area prior to Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. Those two consolidations, in fact, came as a smoke and mirror move, because the Russian military was apparently well aware of its fragility and vulnerability, both on the Kherson area, given the fact that it had very few means to supply the other side. And those means were basically 4 bridges, 2 road bridges, and 2 rail bridges. The 2 road bridges were actually one dam, the Nowa Kakao Dam, and of course Antonovsky Bridge. And the 2 rail bridges, well, you know already, it was the parallel bridge in the Antonovka area, and another one a bit further upstream. On top of it, there was another choke point, which was a bridge over the Konka River, which made the transit from Kherson proper over to Kherson on the other bank. You had a band of land there that was connected by 2 bridges, one over the Konka River, the other was the Antonovsky Bridge. And that was actually the biggest choke point of the two. And therefore, at that point, Kherson went extremely ornery, because while the Russians were more or less prepared to defend Kherson against the attacks, especially at Davydiv Brid, we all know what happened. Like, for a good month and a half, the Ukrainians could not move very far. They were getting quote-unquote slaughtered. Unfortunately, that month and a half was put to good use to actually attract as many Russians to defend Kherson, and of course to deplete the Kharkov area garrisons and their equipment, and also sow panic. There was, of course, a deeper issue in 2022, which was a lack of manpower, lack of mobilization, despite the fact that the Russians launched the mobilization that would see from 300 to 370,000 people mobilized. The partial mobilization that happened, that was actually issued in September 2022. They started that process drawing the list and everything around the month of July. They thought that they wouldn't need it, and unfortunately they did need that. And of course, dysfunctions, lies, misconceptions over what the Ukrainians were doing or trying to do gave the situation that you know, which was a choke pointing of the forces on the western bank of the Kherson River, actually the northern bank, given the position of that part, and the attack of the Nowa Kakao Dam, the Antonovsky Bridge, the 2 rail bridges, and of course a systematic attack around the Konka Bridge, which transformed the initial smart defense of David Dobrev into a slow and painful retreat, with a first collapse around the month of October, early October, when the troops that were closer to Kryvyi Rog had to pull behind because they were being targeted. And also, that's where I first explained to you guys the fire base management. The Russians had almost no more fire base on Kherson. They didn't have the depth to counter anything with artillery, and when it came to long-range missile artillery, unfortunately, they had a very small area to move it around on the northern bank of the Kherson Oblast. Therefore, the only way they could react was on the southern bank. The issue is that I think there was a huge miscalculation on who was behind the HIMARS attacks, and now, 3.5 years later, we know that America was behind the targeting and planification of that campaign. And then, well, what happened. So, this introduction is to say that since that moment, when, as I said, we had this smoke and mirror situation, when we thought that, okay, they got Lugansk, they're going to start pushing beyond, solidify Kherson, and then start finally to move towards Nikolaev, because Nikolaev was the bridge between the two sides of the Bug. Once they were over the Bug, then they would start pushing towards Odessa, and that link up. Unfortunately, very quickly, as I said, the fail at Voznесенsk meant that there was not enough depth behind Nikolaev, and I think at that moment, the Kherson area should have been prepared to be abandoned or to be bet upon. So basically, I would have stalled Lugansk conquest for a while and the push in Donetsk Oblast, and would go beyond and try to get to Kryvyi Rog. It's not that the Russians didn't try that, they simply didn't have enough manpower, and they were just wasting equipment on solo rushes. That said, since then, the situation after the two collapses, so basically the loss of northern bank of Kherson, the abandonment, and the very painful loss of over 10,000 square kilometers in Kharkov Oblast, the Russians finally, in a certain sense, started to wear down the manpower primacy of the Ukrainian side. And once that was done, we saw exactly what I initially told you guys, but actually behind me were a group of war criminals. And we had discussed the point that if the Russians can stop the Ukrainians Banon around Kharkov, then the whole problem that Ukrainians had, which was they took whatever they could in Kharkov as a low-hanging fruit, it would grind their own offensive forces deeper down the line, and would start to get a reversal. That reversal started around the month of December, January 2023, and instead of, for some reason, just stalling them, keeping things quiet, the Ukrainians kept going for at least half a month extra, and they started to have their first problems, which were major losses that Ukrainians do not still recognize at this point. This was not being able to get beyond the Oskil line deeper than they had to go. Because what happened is that once they crossed the Oskil line, the Oskol for the Russian side, they got bogged down in the flat, which meant that then the Russian artillery would start and do its job, and the Ukrainians would have to go back to the lines we know now, Kupiansk, Boguslavka, and so forth. And then there was, of course, the Zherebets situation, when the Ukrainians thought that they had with the Zherebets a very strong defensive line, and it took a while for the Russians to do what they did. And the moment they got the Zherebets line, Torske, you know what's going on right now. Russians are getting back to Liman with, I'd say, some results. So once you start analyzing the two sides, as I said, you see that the Russians have the cards to have a military victory that would be centered to what they historically have been good at, which is absorb the first losses, move on the value chain when it comes to the kills, identify the way the enemy moves around, logistically depends on nodules, and then start hitting them in such a way that the grind is not visible for anyone initially. I'm not gonna fucking apologize for saying this in 2023. 2023, I told you guys, trust the grind. The problem with Ukrainians is the input and the output. For a long while, Ukrainians could count on money from the West, equipment from the West, ammunition from the West. And that's how they prepared their counter in 2023. Those days are long gone. If you check the latest numbers since Trump was elected, you can see that America has been contributing less than $1 billion this year in financing for the war, but not only. And the rest of it has been provided majorly by the European Union to the tune of about a bit less than 48 billion euros, which once you analyze it is roughly 27% less than last year, which was already not such a good year America-wise. You may remember it was when Biden launched his 61 billion bullshit because he knew that Trump was going to at least reduce the financing. So what happens now, and this is where the first card is going to play. Russia has a financing problem in the sense that it is now under pressure on its main surplus revenue, which is oil and gas, hydrocarbons, and also other elements, but oil and gas is the most important. Despite the fact that the general prices are going down, the pressure on Russia is very specific because it goes about secondary sanctions, but also a suicidal targeted policy of its historical biggest buyer, which is the European Union, to not buy Russian gas directly anymore. Of course, there are loopholes. Of course, there are long-term contracts within the EU, Slovakia, Hungary, but also a second-hand purchase of liquefied natural gas by the likes of France, Italy, and so forth. So that's the first problem, in the sense that Russia has a financing problem, but it's still nowhere near what the Ukraine is facing. And that's where things are as interesting as they are completely predictable. And Trump makes this worse, but it was always going to be worse. What is this thing? The first thing is that Ukraine, going forward with the war, has a bigger expenditure to fulfill. We have discussed this. At the current ratio, Ukraine has at least $90 billion that they need to pay to killed and missing. The net account for it is about 72 billion, but there are extras that have to be added for multiple families, so forth and so on. Then you have to probably add about 22 billion for those who are wounded in different levels, although I suspect it's a lot more. There is talk about 140,000 infirms, so amputees, guys without an eye, stuff like that. If you put them all in class 1, so about 270,000 US dollars of compensation, then you see that's a huge number. But if we just say like only 40, 50,000 like that, you are looking already at a huge bill of about 120 billion for guys who cannot fight anymore, either are gone or that are missing a leg, an eye, or their sanity. Then you have a lot of other problems when it comes to the financing on the Ukrainian side, and that is, of course, inflation. Ukraine is trying very hard not to raise the exchange rate of its currency, or lower, depending on how you see that, because the hryvnia is within a controlled, pegged system, and a lot of what Ukraine receives are grants, aids, or stuff that it doesn't need to repay right away, which means that the value of the money, honestly, is worthless. Everybody knows this. The hryvnia cannot be higher than the Turkish lira, for instance, or they cannot be higher than the Russian ruble, because there is no self-financing capable of covering both the deficit but also the debt. And on top of it, there is a huge commercial deficit within Ukraine. We are speaking purely of the financial part here, so you guys do not need to tell me about the deficit of the manpower or a deficit of the labor pool. That thing I know already, but we're going to talk about it later. But right now we're speaking purely on the financial issues that Ukrainians have. Those financial issues actually are the pillar from where Ukraine is losing the war. Why? Because Ukraine suddenly is forced to start making radical choices on what they need to pay first. Pensions, treatment of certain functionaries, keeping the VAT at the same level instead of raising it, like Russia did, pay for the killed. That's why you have all of these missing in action. So slowly start to understand that, in fact, what is going to kill Ukraine is the money. It's not how many Mykolas are going to be enlisted to be shot by Russians or blown up by UMPKs or mangled by FPV drones. No, it's how much money can they pay to keep these guys at least equipped, fed, and at the front line. This is the problem that a lot of people are having, and trying to explain this to to people who analyze this war on only one direction, on one segment, is very complicated, because initially you are tempted to just look at the war as people killing each other, which is what the war is. But more than often, to kill each other, people need the means to. And of course, it's guns, it's bombs, it's explosives, it's knives, it's whatever you want. And sometimes the most important part is not the bullets or the artillery, but it's the mean to bring your guys to the point, from point A to point B, or the mean to ensure that your guys. The biggest issue that Ukraine has right now is that they just don't have enough money, even with seized Russian funds and so forth and so on. They should have a lot more money to keep the same level of equipping troops, training them, and fielding them. The problem with TCK, the problem with people fleeing and so forth, is not per se that these guys do not want to fight. A lot of them want to fight. That's not the main issue. The main issue is that the tools these guys get to fight, the missions they get, the positions they have, the way how they're looked into the greater scheme of things on the Ukrainian side, especially defensively. And you hear this logic very often. Oh, you know what? Now the way is to put plots. Anyone who has any kind of experience with the military knows that that's the way how you start losing. America did something similar in Afghanistan by putting these guys in dominant positions, but rather isolated in order to control the roads. The same thing that the Soviets had done. The same thing as the Brits had done over 100 years prior. That is a recipe for disaster, because the way a defensive system works is, while it is interconnected, and this interconnection is both tactical, which means you can move from position to position with a sufficient cover, or at least some kind of cover. You can communicate in a way that will not get disrupted, and you can also be resupplied, be defended, be reinforced, be rotated, whatever you fucking want to call it, in a way that will still allow you to perform defensively. The new logic, and this is something that homosexuals like play for at some point, have, but not only him, also Andy the pedo, they have pushed forward. That's suiciding those 2-3 people. That's also making it extremely complicated for those 2-3 people to be able to defend. I already explained that in January 2025 and prior to that. But the problem with the plotted defense is that the plots need to be tight enough so if someone goes through the first line of plots, he's going to come within a kill zone. That's just not the case with Ukraine. And of course, the biggest problem of it is the lack of manpower. But it's not just the lack of manpower per itself. As I said, it's also there is no money to be able to afford to these plots a coherent system in where to defend themselves. And it's true that a lot of that is because these idiots think that drones are going to save the day. I already explained the problem with drones is their inherent logistical burden. Unless you have drones on the way every 5 minutes, a drone will have a flight time, an ETA. Given now that closed drone teams get fucked up, that ETA is at least 5 minutes. And I'm going to tell you, it's true that 5 minutes by human pace is not that much. Admitting that these guys go at 5 to 6 kilometers per hour, because they are loaded and shit like that, 5 minutes is between 800 meters and 1 kilometer. Because the drone is to get first flown out. So those 5 minutes or ETA correspond more or less to about 10 minutes of total time. There needs to be a recognition of the position. You need to pull out the FPVs, because you know that you can just not fucking stand in the open nilly-willy. You're going to get whatever the Russians have in menu for you. So those 5 minutes ATA mean 10 minutes totally, mean between 800 meters and 1 kilometer of distance crossed. And that changes everything in this type of war. If your plots are not close enough, the Russians can simply go undetected down to the point, as I said, when you're going to find them, as we saw in Seversk. They're in the city, they're waiting for a shitty rotation, they're covering it with their own drones, and they just take it out. And this, once again, is not something that is a good option. It's something that the Russians force on the Ukrainians, both by the tactics, but also by the attrition. This attrition has, as I said, a huge financial counterpart. You know, for a lot of people, it was very funny when, the Bradleys were going to come, the Leopards were going to come, the Abrams were going to come, and all that shit. The issue with these things is that, first of all, they cost a lot of money. And that money, as I said, needs to get out from somewhere. On top of it, they are very maintenance intensive in order to be tip-top. One of the things that has always been told by everyone, and you see that in common literature, saying, the rate of failures of Soviet tanks was sometimes up to 10 times worse than, for example, Leopard 2. And the Poles also started giving this one out. The issue is that those 10 times is because the German tanks had some advantages, but also were always kept at very low mileage. And I know there were tests, I know that Leopards were heads-on and so forth, but the support cast around it, the ecosystem around it, was completely different. Now pull the same tank out, get it to the Ukrainians, give them just enough sustainment. We know that, for instance, the Americans never gave any kind of sustainment for the first Abrams, Bradley, and Stryker force. There was even a congressional inquiry over it. And you're going to have a way worse result, which would cost you more. On top of it, the other issue that you're going to have is that logistically, you are spending more. It's true that, for instance, the T-72 is very frugal. The engine is not a world wonder. There are a lot of idiosyncrasies with the tank. But at the end of the day, you can still make it work the way Ukrainians are making it work and the Russians are making it work. And if you see the major request that Ukraine had at some point wasn't really Leopards. It was they wanted to have tanks that they could sustain themselves. And of course, that's when we have the Poles and the Czechs and everyone else dumping their export T-72s. And Ukrainians did not complain about that. I repeat, if you see what was lost in Kursk, the major part of the tanks that the Ukrainians were using were their own or the donations from Czechs and co. So once you start analyzing properly, Ukraine wants to do this war on the cheap because the war is getting more expensive, even with the baseline limits financially they have. And I'd say that one of the biggest trouble that Ukrainians have is that the sponsors are expensive idiots. Whereas the Russians, it's true, maybe are using whatever, T-54s, 55, 62s, but they control that sourcing. Is it complicated? Is it cannibalization? Of course, yes, it is. This war is at an attritional level, which defies the imaginations for any kind of force in Europe or the US. And still the Russians keep coming. This is the beauty of this war. If anyone would tell you that the French should go into a 60, 70,000 casualty charge to get roughly 400 square kilometers of area, more or less around Bakhmut, and then fight another year for Chasiv Yar, nobody's going to accept that. The French, the Americans, anyone. The adversity, the aversion for casualties is such that nobody can comprehend that. The issue, though, is that the next war those motherfuckers are going to take part into, and even if it's against Bantus, they will still have to cope with everything that Ukrainians and Russians are launching to itself. So, financially, the burden that the Western alliance is adding to Ukraine, on top of the fact that Ukraine needs to fight literally a global power like Russia, is a huge watershed moment where you understand that even with the stolen Russian funds, Ukraine will just barely survive for 2 years at the level they are fighting right now, which is not very good generally. So when people start telling, oh yeah, everything's going to be fine if we allocate the budget for next year with Russian funds, no, it's not going to be okay. They're just going to stay at the same level. So that's your first and main issue that Ukraine failed to solve in 2025. And financially, the war didn't get better for Ukraine, it got worse. It got worse for Russia as well. That's how I started this part. But it also means that the financial part doesn't have a counterpart in results. So even if Ukraine has more money, the inflation spike that they will have by ordering, I don't know, more artillery rounds, more vehicles. It's just eating up. I explained this year over how the French, despite the fact that they had a sizable extension of their budget, in reality have a very little progress into that. And given how their budget was already deficitary for the defense, they do not have the funds to actually operate within the limits I had set. So basically, the whole bullshit about doubling the budget within 14 years is already handicapped by the debts that the French military already has due to past projects. Plus now they need to sustain Ukraine. Of course, they do it very similar with the Germans, for instance, or other parts. But it's still there. Now, the other problem that we're having with Ukrainians when it comes to the money is not corruption. I will not talk about that because Russia still has that problem as well. But the fact that they do not seem to understand how to employ strategically that money. And of course, I already explained what. A big chunk of that money has to do with the fact that they have promised Walala to their warriors. So if you die for Ukraine, you get $500,000, a bit more than $500,000. The issue is that the pressure from the Russians makes that you start losing more people. Therefore, one of your biggest budgetary problems is not how to equip new guys, but how to pay the guys who are dead. And of course, that has a small solution, as you know already, which is pretending that these guys are just missing. 3 years missing, 2 years missing, a year and a half missing. What the fuck you want? This leads to the follow-up. So you cannot control your cost sinking due to the fact that your guys get curtailed in Mirnograd, your guys get curtailed in Siversk, your guys get curtailed in Liman, your guys get curtailed in Zaporozhye. On top of it, you cannot counter the UMPKs, you cannot counter the Shahids, and on top of it, the Russians are destroying some level of infrastructure, which is costing you a lot of money. One of those, for instance, is rail assets, locomotives, and repair centers. Those are extremely painful to Ukraine. So, to summarize all this, the financial cost for Ukraine of this war, on top of the fact that they need more money to the inflation spike, on top of the fact they need more money due to the fact that they need to reevaluate and make it more appealable for some people to still join, but also to survive, because in reality the inflation is hitting Ukraine day to day. So the dude who is at war, who cannot work at his normal job, and who gets, I don't know, because he's a Sturmovik or he's a frontline fighter, 1.8 K dollars, that money is needed to keep his family alive, but everything is getting more expensive. So the vicious circle of inflation that hits every level of Ukrainian society does not help with the vicious circle of attrition, taking out people from the civil society, from the labor pool, putting them in military fatigues, and killing them off. So the structural slippery slope, I'd say, as I already explained, is that Ukraine is not only having issues getting enough people to replace the losses, but it's also forced to actually reduce its ambitions when it comes to mobilization. Because too much will, just as I said, burn the candle by both ends, and at the end, you might survive 6 more months, but 6 months after, you have nothing anymore. It's just a logical, frugal use of your limited assets. Ukraine needs to eat steak every day to sustain the Russians, but they can only afford ramen, instant noodles, because everybody in their huge fucking army needs to actually eat, be supplied, rest, be able to fire at least 10 shots. And more recently, some people from the other side have written that Ukraine cannot sustain an army of 800,000, a million people in a peace situation. So in any case, it's going to go down, with reference of the now infamous project of peace, ceasefire, whatever you want to call it. But that thing that also works now, even now, because Ukraine's economy is completely lopsided. There's one thing that I told to the group, and they know this one, it's not the first time. There is a war gentry within Ukraine right now. There are a lot of people who are taking advantage of how the war is going on. A lot of people are taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine has decided to go full drone. When I made the analysis of the Kaufman piece, this was the last space, I pointed out that the dronification of the Ukrainian army, while it is dangerous for the Russians, is also a limit on itself. And the most recent publication by the Ukrainian Air Force, who said that the F-16s had dropped bombs on 300 targets and had shot down, how much was it? 1,300 or 1,600 Shahids over a year. Once you start making analysis, you see that they are irrelevant. It's there where Ukraine can win the war. It's not with a million FPVs going after Mobiks, FPVs which they're going to get back. The optimization of the combat power for the Ukrainian side is not to try to go toe-to-toe with Russians on stuff that Russians can replicate. It's to find a way to stop the Russians from bombing them from 100 kilometers. And once again, it has nothing to do also with oil refineries, with stopping the Russians from getting money. It doesn't work like that. Russia has the means to repair that shit and also be a lot more painful to Ukraine. Right now, Ukraine, despite the access to more long-range drones, still has less than Russia, and Ukrainians themselves know that. Everybody has pointed that one out. And at the meantime, the biggest advantage Ukraine has had, which was striking Russian advancing troops with FPVs, is going away, mostly because the Russians, as I said, using optifiber FPVs, are just being more efficient. There is no way right now to stop them except for putting a lot of trash around your car or your tank. And that's the whole point. Financially, Ukraine is sinking due to the fact that it's not having what the guys at Timor Criminals said to you for now 2.5 years. They cannot level the playing field the way they used to. They cannot kill 4 Russians for 1 Ukrainian. Even with the equipment losses, they are not there anymore. Equipment losses, we already posted. We have this moment, and on top of it, what Oryx is posting as losses on one side to the other is complete bullshit, because there are a lot more losses if you start counting on them on the Ukrainian side. The main problem that Ukrainians are having right now is that it's not Rubicon, as I said. The main problem is that they cannot extend the input of pickups, of UGVs, of any kind of asset to help them level the playing field with the Russians. They just can't, because in order to have a pickup, you have to have a driver. But if, as I said, the Rubicon kills 800 drivers, that means 800 vehicles. You still have to pick them, have those 800 drivers and send them up. If the same company would send 30 pickups on the same area and Rubicon would kill them, you have 1/4 of the company dead by doing just driving around. Not combat tasks, just fucking doing rotations, doing resupplies. And if you follow the discussions I had with Gefra over what attrition is, this is attrition. And this is the perfect attrition because you kill a mean to resupply people, to rotate people, but also the driver. You hit both the Jivaya Sila and the equipment that goes with it. Financially, I know that people are going to say, yeah, but this pickups. Yeah, but start losing 1,000 pickups per month on tape. I'm not talking about Russians sending 20 grants, torching a whole fucking park of trucks. Start doing that math. Start losing 1,000 drivers per month. You have only 12,000 guys that are dying just driving people around. They're not doing any fighting. It's pure loss. It's pure win for the Russians. And of course, the same thing happens to the Russians as well. I'm not blind to that, but I'm just telling you how problematic this is for Ukraine. When you start having your losses at your backbone, at the backbone of your military, which is logistics, you have a problem. That's how the Russians got fucked in 2022. And so the financial part, the money part, is extremely simple. War is becoming more expensive for both sides, but Ukraine has just less. It has a smaller wallet. It has a huge political issue with one American president that, of course, he's not completely sold on the fact of dumping the Ukrainians, but his worldview, his vision, and his hatred and fixation with China makes that it doesn't want this to degenerate. I think, in my opinion, thinks that Russia is worn down enough to not be a problem down the line, especially because Russia winning the war opens another issue, which is sustaining the peace. The sanctions that are on Russia are unilateral. The only one to decide when they're going to get moved out is not Russia. It's not an automatic thing that you stop the fighting and the Americans and Europeans are going to pull the sanctions, especially when it comes to oil and gas. The Europeans have put a political program that sees Russia not selling them anything past 2027. Once again, this is something that is suicidal for Europeans, but they're ready to do it because it's mental midgets who are in charge right now. So you cannot do much. And when it comes to America, for America, of course, it has a vested interest on trying to get as much market shares in Europe from the Russians. Although the Norwegians have replaced Russia, but the Norwegians just do not have the stock, the reserves to keep going for more than 10 to 15 years at the same level. And therefore, for the Americans playing the long game, this is perfect. And of course, it could also be perfect for Russia because in 10 years, as I said, there is a fat chance that the situation in Europe degenerates to the point when we have a Argentina on steroids for the whole continent. It will be painful, guys. I'm sorry to say it like that for the European part. Now, of course, that pain is going to be shared by Russia as well because they're going to start to scavenge where to sell things, how to make money over stuff. And a war is never a good moment to have a substitution program for a lot of stuff. That's why they are now having trouble with the Chinese overproduction and the Chinese overcapacity. That is true for Russia because there is no other possibility. There is no way to actually go beyond it. If you want, the only major source for a lot of stuff, be that technical equipment, precision machines, part replacement for stuff that they bought from the West, quote unquote, either they do it themselves, which is not always possible, or they're going to get it from the Chinese, which were already producing at least 80% for the Europeans themselves. So the financial situation is very tight for both sides. But for Ukraine, as I said, smaller wallet, it is way worse. The second part is not the attrition part. I'm going to talk about it later. The second part where Ukraine has a huge problem is there was this piece, I think, from The Economist of some editor there who said Putin doesn't have a victory program or a victory plan. Oh, I disagree right away, but that's not the problem, disagreeing. The problem is that it is Ukraine who has no victory plan. For Ukraine, the whole thing is we're going to do in Afghanistan and we're going to hope that Russia gets tired. The problem is that that works in Afghanistan like it works for the US or Russia if it's far, if it's not important, and of course when you will have logistical constraints. For Russia, Ukraine is next door. Second of all, the situation is a mid-level, high-intensity warfare. You are not in World War II where both sides are dumping millions of men to each other, but the level of losses for the level of troops involved is very high. I think it's one of the worst wars in recent memory when it comes to attrition operationally. The other, in my opinion, I say it was Iraq, the Daesh situation, and Syria, when you had whole wipeouts per movement. And you had groups from each side wiping out each other. And you could see like absolute disasters. 30 from one side, 50 on one side, 15, 20, so forth. Same thing in Ukraine. The difference is it's not because the fighters are incompetent, but because the fight has moved to a completely different level. And the quasi-transparency of the battlefield right now makes it extremely complicated to have a quote-unquote classical war. So, why Russia has the cards? Russia, in my opinion, has the cards because, as I said, the Ukrainians do not have any other plan than just play dead, get beaten the shit out of them, and hope that Russia is going to tire or implode or whatever. And some guys, Berlinska, for instance, Azov acolyte, said, oh, we're going to wait them out 10 to 12 years. And I'm like, I have no problem with that, especially if the rate of losses is like this year. By the way, there was a last exchange, I think 1,000 for 30. You know what, this 1,000 white bags of frozen pigs for 30 rations. But once again, if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to have this discussion. I'm happy that every year we're going to lose between 40 and 60,000 killed and double that with heavily wounded and Iraqs. I have no issue with Ukraine for 10 years losing permanently something between 120 and 180,000 people. Imagine the lack of productivity, the lack of fertility, the lack of territory, because the more Ukraine keeps going like this, the less territory it keeps. Of course, it's piano piano, but that's the thing. At some point, everybody's going to look around and we cannot do this. And this already exists, actually. Only the ideologicals like that bitch think like that. The other people look at the problem. Look at the non-kinetic attrition, which is people just getting the fuck out of their positions. Straight up deserting or going AWOL within the very complex definition we see in Ukraine. When these guys just hide and wait that they're going to be an amnesty or get the units changed, or just not come. And the beauty of this is the following. Nobody gives a fuck if Ukraine loses, I'm going to tell you, tomorrow Ukraine is going to capitulate. And Europe will not fucking bat an eyelash. America doesn't care already. For America, it's just a pretext to hit on Russia and make everything complicated for Europe and force upon them a renegotiation of their tutelage to America. And they succeeded. Trump managed to cock the whole fucking European leadership. So for as long as Ukraine will be these guys at their helm with zero plan on how to beat Russia, and trust me, we're gonna fucking choke Russia's revenue and all that shit, it's not gonna matter. I'm gonna tell you why. The Russians have spent almost now 4 years fucking the Ukrainians up to a quasi-nuclear level. We are talking about guys sending their women abroad to save them, and within 1 to 2 years, their women are getting fucked by someone else abroad. We are talking about people making their ends meet while using the oldest profession in the world. We are talking about Ukrainians taking breathtaking risks just not to get enlisted. We are talking about Ukrainians seeing scenes from their TCK goons that, in my opinion, will never be able to reconcile that country with its political system once the war is done. And we are talking about guys openly stealing and making a mockery of the invincibility bullshit within Ukraine. And there where the war gentry enters, the Pritulas, the Brovdis, the Sternenkos, and all the assholes around it that benefit from this war. And part of that, as I said, it is exactly that. Nobody has a plan to win because right now everybody's taking a piece of the pie at the helm. Something that a lot of people are trying to reproach to Russia, but you can see that the Russians are not doing that. There are profits being made from this war, but at the same time the Russians are cracking down on over-profiteering, or at least targeting that over-profiteering when it's not within the ranks. Recent articles sees over 155 high-ranking officials in Russia being thrown in jail, being investigated, or being condemned. The latest of them, one of the most powerful figures, is Timur Ivanov. The former, let's call him right wing of Shoigu. Meanwhile, we have two defense ministers in Ukraine who are hit by corruption scandals. Reznikov made a killing with his buddies over food supplies for the Ukrainian military. Now Umerov has his fingers in the most recent scandals. That, by the way, is this bullshit. It's nothing. 100 million siphoned over energetical projects is nothing. Is zero. When the war will be ended, you will see that billions have been siphoned over shit. Because 100 millions is nothing. Ukraine almost got conned out of about 37 million by some dude in Arizona. They have overpaid for ammunition. The Czechs got butt raped the first year of their fucking ammunition initiative, with up to 42% of the ammunition bought from traders from war criminals without a check of the quality and being forced to be refurbished. We've had fucking Albanian overpriced 60mm mortar rounds invoiced $1,200, guys. I honestly laughed my ass off with people who did that. And Ukraine said nothing. The Czechs said nothing. The French were part of the deal, said nothing. They said, let's go, bitch. The amortization of 60mm mortar rounds from 73 to 77 on the Albanian budget, by the time it was supposed to be neutralized, we speak 2008, was 71 euro, which meant destruction and neutralization of the explosive charge. Of course, there was a cost. So it's almost 20 times the fucking cost of just getting rid of it. That's the beauty of this war. On both sides you got profiteering, but on Ukraine, you got an absolute level of shit show. We're not going to talk about the molots. We're not going to talk about the faulty revision of gearboxes for T64s and T72s. We're not going to talk about the awful initiative to have Roshel generators being assembled in Ukraine. Well, you saw what kind of actual results you had. We will not talk about the excellent Ingvar map slash EMV, who has been produced in exactly 12 pieces for an order of about 200. Two of them already seen blown up and one seen attacked and burning on their own video, driving with a fucking fire on the left pontoon and on the tire. Pure beauty, guys. So the problem, as I said, of the lack of plan is also because the war is making some people rich in Ukraine. And then you're going to have the issue of what happens when the war stops. War is a very, very good business for some guys. Because you need the FPVs, you need the Baba Yagas, you need the bombs, you need the explosives. You need to fight every day. It's not as, let's say, a normal business when, let's say, an iPhone, you're going to need it for 1 or 2 or 3 years. And once you sell it, the extra purchase from the customer is going to be something small. With war, it's not like that. With war, you need the ammo. You need the 2,500, 3,500, 4,500 dumb 155mm ammunition. You need the propelling charges. There is a cost, of course. There is raw material, there is transport, there is storage and stuff. But it's an ongoing consumption. It's better than drugs, guys. Because it's legal. So, once the situation turns into the shit show we all know, with profiteering, and the war has to stop at some point, simply because the Ukrainians do not have the positions to defend at the same level, or the Russians simply broke through for them, or the attrition has taken its toll. Ukraine would need to go back to what it was. But just realize this. If this goes to the, at least, Russian demands, that means that Ukraine will find itself 25% smaller. Then it would need to attract people back to make itself livable, to relaunch the birth ratio. Then the state would need to start picking up the missing in action, pay them back, keep going with amputees, keep going with infirms, and start rebuilding. The budget for reconstruction, we're not going to take the bullshit from World Bank, all that stuff. I wish it was that high. But Ukraine can surely do with about 300 to 400 billion. The problem once you do that is that, of course, it's not going to take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So the moment your reconstruction is going to stretch over 10, 15 years, inflation is going to impact it. But also, as I said, theft, graft, corruption. And for a lot of war profiteers, they would like to actually clear up their funds, launder them into normal projects, reconstruction, business, whatever. And these guys will have it extremely difficult if the reconstruction is done through the Western auspices. Not that there's not going to be any kind of corruption, quite the contrary. But you will need to share your shit. And always with the risk in the back of your head that at some point, you're going to get fucked. At some point, they know how much you have, they know where it is. They're just going to fucking kill you. Or better, just throw you in jail and strip you of your assets. And make you sit on the bottle. The problem with war profiteering is that a lot of these guys will need to take that money out at the end of the war. That's why there is no definitive winning plan for the moment. If you want an example of that, Madja Robert Brody said, I'm not staying in fucking Ukraine when we signed the armistice. Part of it is that because they're going to kill his ass, but the other part is that they're going to kill his ass not because he killed Russians, but because also he probably made a lot of dough on the side. And Ukraine is a mafia state. So, you have a lack of plan from the military, political part of the Ukrainian society, which is partly due to the fact that people have made their money, they just don't know how to stop this fucking cash machine. And they also feel that once it's stopped, you need to clear that cash out, and it means that you either retain your political upper hand or you get out of the country, which also exposes you to corruption inquiries, to straight up assassinations. I mean, these guys they know exactly what they're doing. So the consensus on how to stop the war within Ukraine is not there. This is why Zelensky right now cannot just stop it and say, okay, we're going to get out of Donbass and give you this and that, but we want the war to stop. A lot of people still think that it's going to be an L for the Russians to do this and that, but that's not the case. The biggest L is for the Ukrainians because the current system has been living off a Ponzi scheme, a military Ponzi scheme, and they do not know how to turn the tap off and switch back to a normal economy. Ukraine already had no normal economy. It was literally Russia on steroids when it came to corruption, when it came to vested interests, graft, nepotism. And that's the beauty of it. And now we got to the third point, where Russia has the upper hand due to the very poor Ukrainian attrition situation. One thing that I was always worried of was that at some point Ukraine, as I said, would start petering out and you would have these localized collapses. And I told you guys, and the team said just the same. You have the Fox effect. You think that everything is cool and clean on the outside and suddenly everything crumbles. But it's not that collapse. It's not this huge dam going down and everything's flooding in. No, it's a collapse which is hurting you and forcing you to watch losing everything you had won before. And suddenly you are looking at the prospect that if it's not stopped soon enough, everything's going to follow up. But that means that the destruction and the collapse will be exponential. Thanks to Trump, because he made the remark, right now to take the rest of Donbass, there is about 5,000 square kilometers. Russia holds about 2.5 square kilometers outside of the Donbass. We're not speaking Zaporozhye or Kherson. We're speaking Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, and Kharkov. And a small bit of Nikolaev, but it's purely performative. It's a bit of a Kinburg speed. So, if the war keeps going like this, the level of ground that Ukraine will have in Donbass would be going down, and therefore Russian level in Donbass will be going up, but also the level of territories that Russia controls outside of its legalistic claims, which is the annexation before Oblast, is going to go up. So at some point, the swap would be the only way for Ukraine not to lose everything. Because the moment Russia goes to 1,000 square kilometers missing in Donbass and 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers between Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, you start having a problem. Because that's how Russia also did some of its referendums. Not enough territory to control the whole oblast, but just enough to say, oh, you know what, they voted, it's mine. So how would you like to start losing Dnipropetrovsk Oblast by Russia claiming that there was a vote for it? I know it sounds crazy because you need to at least control Dnipropetrovsk, but who the fuck cares? Nobody controls Zaporozhye. There was a quote-unquote referendum. Same for Kherson. They do not own the capital of the oblast. Kherson is still Russian, legally. It's really not a problem, guys. So what are you going to do if you're Ukraine and you see that coming? You should, right now that you still have a big bunch you can negotiate over, those 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers, you should sit. But you cannot do that. Why? Because in order for them to sit, they will need to accept that they are in a weaker position. So the most concessions are going to come from them. And you know what this means. If you start conceding a finger, you're going to concede a fist, then the whole forearm. And I don't think that Zelensky can stand the blow, let's say it like this. Neither does Ukraine. Although they have a lot of porn stars and OnlyFans operatives. So, Ukraine is in catch-22 situation when they know that if the attrition goes like this, they're going to have to fucking deal with Russia in a way worse position. Everybody's saying it. And this is what we said from the beginning. Accept it now, be better, cheat the Russians again, put NATO troops, and you're going to save yourself the misery of another war in 4 or 5 years. Nope, we're not doing that. 91 borders. We want Crimea. We still haven't canceled the Crimean Beach Party tickets. No problem. How about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast Narodna Republika? How about Kharkov? How about we make this junction and we jump on fucking Sumi? At the end, as I explained, the problem of Ukraine is that strategically, they have lost the initiative for good. Only way for them to recover it, to recover the initiative, not to win the war, not even fucking reverse Russian gains, to recover the initiative, which means that they could go on the offensive, is if the fucking NATO comes in to play. The problem, for as long as NATO is the European militaries, ain't gonna happen simply because they cannot have right now they do not have the capability to put enough baddies on the battlefield. And I'm gonna repeat, both sides are going through 150 to 200,000 people, wounded, sick, killed, missing, traumatized per year. Then you add on Ukrainian side over who are AWOL or deserters. If you analyze this year for Ukraine, it means that the whole army of France and the whole army of Germany, the operation active part that can be deployed, is killed, maimed, wounded, or is AWOL. Actually, you can add the British Army as well, because, we're speaking about 240,000 people. The active components of those are gone. And that's 1 year of fighting. We can pretend that everything's going to be changed by NATO intervention, but the soft NATO intervention that Macron wanted, which meant it was meant as a tripwire, like, oh, if you attack us, we're going to go in with the big guns. And I'm like, bitch, what big guns? In average, you would need 60 days to transport 1 or 2 brigades in Ukraine. And you'll need to fucking dump them at the border because the rail gauge is not the same. Or you need to pull them through Moldova. The fuck are you talking about, fucking moron? And they need, for the moment, at least a month within Europe to transfer troops at the required level. They say 45 days, I'd say 1 month. This is the state of the European militaries for the moment. And I doubt the Turks gonna be like, oh yeah, we're gonna, for sure, we're going to fight Russia. Yeah, fine. Çok güzel. So, what the fuck do you think is gonna happen for Ukraine, attrition-wise? And I'm saying they can kill even double the Russians they think they kill. Very simple. We're gonna have the same creeping Russian advance for another year. Probably now they're gonna finish with over 5,000. And that means that 5,000 square kilometers. That means that next year they're gonna maybe not double it, but they're gonna be at 8,000. 8,000 means that Donbass is gone, and probably a huge chunk of remaining of Zaporozhye is gone as well. And the rest cannot be touched because whatever remains is gonna be Kherson. And Kherson, there is the river. You want to do the crossover. You're gonna try and attack through Energodar. I don't think Russia is gonna try that. On the other side, it's gonna be fine if the Ukrainians try that shit. They haven't tried it except for some bullshit action on an island like 7 kilometers from the other shore, which is not an island anymore because the reservoir is mostly dried. So Ukraine right now, unless Putin dies and we have a big bang event in Russia, is looking at the same shit as this year plus 50%. Which means that for the rest of the year 2026, Russia theoretically fulfills at least its minimal goals. And I told you guys, they don't even need most of Zapo. They just need to be close enough Zapo that they can fucking optifiber the shit out of it and can have UMPKs dumped on the bridges. Isolate from the Western Bank, and that's it. You got Zapo there. Because in order to reinforce, to resupply the city, you need to come up north. So in Enfilad, if you want to see Pisarivka to Sudzha on steroids, allow the Russians to go to Komishevaka, south of Zaporozhye city. And don't forget, in order to defend a city like Zapo, the Ukrainians would need to triple at least the level of losses they took in Pokrovsk and they took in Kursk. I'll let you do the count, do that math. That's the problem that the Ukrainians opened to themselves when they started doing this FPV bullshit. What happened in Kherson in 2022 is going to be repeated on Zaporozhye city in 2026 if the war goes that far. I cannot wait. I hope Zelepidor is not going to cock. He's going to take the bullet, end up like Mussolini. I fear that he's going to be made to cock at some point. And we had Budanov said that we have a window in February 2026, which means that in February 2026, two major cities will have been completely lost. This is my opinion. So Pokrovsk for sure is gone with Mirnograd, and probably Kupiansk is finished with the potential of the Russians to cross way deeper and start threatening from Volchansk the Stary Saltov passage to Lipovetsk, which means that the Ukrainian northern supply road would be a small square between Izium and Balakleya. UMPK carousel. That's all I have to say. Plus bridges, plus bullshit, plus optifiber FPVs, etc., etc. So everything that Ukraine was proud and was happy to rub to Russia's face in 22 or 23, and in a limited variant in 2 weeks in August 2024 in Kursk, it's going to get up its ass for the length of 2026. Unless something changed, like the Russians say, you know what, we don't want this, or there is some kind of cataclysm economically, globally, like a huge recession, and everybody just scrambles to, stay alive. Any other thing, any other situation for Ukraine means a slow and painful beatdown, which leaves them roughly at October, November 2026, with only two possibilities. Accept a worse peace proposal than in November 2025, or go all in Capitulio 9, and then you are going for the type of war that Ukrainians cannot sustain, even if they have to fight the Russians with shovels. They cannot sustain that shit. And it means slowly but surely a creeping advance to Dnipropetrovsk, and it means a loss of the Dnieper river bank over 50 to 80 kilometers in length from Zapo to Dnipro, which means that there will be no commercial movement. There will be no commercial exploitation of the two hydropower plants. And there will be no transit over there. That will leave the crossing to defend whatever is north on the eastern bank, two main passages, one being Kremenchuk, and I swear to God, that one's going to be funny, and then of course Kiev. And that would force a return to Kiev of the Russian military. And this time we're going to laugh. And you can say 6 years to Kiev, I wouldn't fucking care, for as long as we can see Zile Bobik hanged from the Bankova. So the only point that is now to be answered by the Ukrainian leadership is, how long are we going to get butt fucked? And are we taking the lube or not? That's it. There is no other choice as it stands. I'm not confident that Russia is not going to fuck this up by trying to find a solution, because they're suffering as well. It doesn't go only one way, but one side has it worse. That's the meaning. The moment things happen the way they should be happening, that moment you are going to see not a crumbling of defensive positions, but the impossibility of those defensive positions to start making any sense or making any difference to the overall advance of the Russian military. And I said, I have no issue with people saying 6 years to Kiev. I don't care. You know, if it takes 6 years to rape your ass, I still got your ass. You can cry. Crying in the casino will not get you unbombed, Mr. Pigger. So I don't understand this joke. The cope that sees the snail pace to Kiev or the snail pace to win the war in Ukraine, it's just that, it's cope. Historically, my region has suffered from guys who took centuries to subdue us. The guy we consider our national hero in Albania fought for over 30 years. We still lost. That's the fucking problem with the imperial mindset. You're just a line on a map. Although, for Monkey, there is obvious some sentimentalism involved. Otherwise, he would have gone scorched earth on some aspects. He hasn't done that. So he still thinks with his heart up to a certain point. So we are onto our fourth year. Fifth, actually, because this is the fourth. Ask yourself if it's funny to say Kiev in 3 days or Kiev in 6 years. Ask yourself. Ask yourself if it's funny to say, oh, the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War for the Russians was ended within 4 years. People, this is becoming a political extermination war. Russia didn't want to erase Ukraine, but what's going on is forcing Russia to go to that length. First of all, by slicing a huge chunk of its territory, but by also eliminating its combat power, its economy, its people. And the elimination is not just killing them, but just making them go away. And park all these guys in a smaller territory, heightening tensions, forcing this cohabitation that for very long in Ukraine was simple, because it was eastern bank of the Dnieper and the western bank. Western Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, northern Ukraine. Now, all those guys who want to be Ukrainian are all together we're going to be all together on the West Bank. How do you think this is going to change the political shift and the political power within that area? We already had cases when Western Ukrainians are saying to Donbas people to get the fuck out. That's the whole point here. The changes that are going to befall Ukraine due to monkey's policies are groundbreaking. They're long, they're painful from everybody involved, but they are changing the face of Ukraine. Hopefully, it's called something different soon enough. I was against this war for a long time because it would be a repeat on series of what happened in ex-Yugoslavia. I know that I'm not part of that. I mean, like, I'm not from Kosovo, so I was never part of that. But it's still very complicated to see how people start hating each other. And the difference is nihil. Ukrainians and Russians, you're going to have the same kind of situation that you had with peoples of ex-Yugoslavia. Of course, not the same exact, very similar situations. And the currents underneath that facade that was ex-Yugoslavia, they haven't made any of those countries progress. I'm sorry to say it, because that's also the case for us in Albania. There hasn't been any progress. Everybody's declining on the population. Everybody wants to go away. People killed each other. Families completely blew up for that land to call them theirs, and now everybody's fleeing. I don't know if you guys understand how painful that is for someone like me, because it's happening in Albania as well. We had a different scenario with that, so I'm not going to put myself into ex-Yugoslavia politically, but everyone is fleeing. Now imagine what's going to happen with Russia and Ukraine. That's why I was opposed to this war, because it's a cemetery of nations, of people, of you, of me, of them. But now that we're there, the war has to be fought to its logical end. And unfortunately, when the brother, the cousin, the friend doesn't want to understand that he's wrong, because Ukraine is wrong in this one. It's not about them being independent or about them being prosperous and shit like that. No, it's about them projecting themselves as a counter Russia. Someone says that I'm here to counter you. Someone says that I'm here to fight you. Okay, come on, bitch. Let's do it. This suicidal nationalism that has been cajoled, groomed multiple times by the West, by the way, that has had terrible consequences for everyone involved. This is wrong. And of course, there is an imperial sense to the Russian predicament here. People ignoring it are blind. The problem is, you're there, they're there, they're bigger than you. It's natural to have this situation. Do I like to be in a neighborhood? I'm going to tell you guys, don't take me wrong, especially my Slavic buddies. Do I like as an Albanian to be a bit ostracized in my region because I'm surrounded by Slavic people? No. Is there a common ground to be found so we don't slaughter with each other? Yes. And that common ground for Europeans was to balkanize our asses, to make us so small that we just couldn't stand any kind of conflict. And for them, this works. For us, it doesn't. Because now the shit show is so complete that we just cannot, start having a common discussion to how the fuck are we going to do to not disappear from our own lands. Same for Ukraine. On top of the complete self-deletion from 90 to 2003, 2004, when there were from 53 million to like 48, since Crimea got fucked, they lost another 10 million. And then with the war, they lost another 9 to 10 million. And they're fucking happy. That's the beauty of it. They're happy. Of course, they're not happy. But the idiots who are pushing them to suicide are happy. And of course, there is a very morbid and macabre situation on the Russian side. It's not to be denied either. But that's the point of being big, and that's the point of affording your actions. That's how America works as well. So I do not see anyone trying to depict this as some ultra-imperialist, nationalist Russian ogre trying to eat small, pure Ukraine. No, it's not like that. There is an objective risk for Russia to leave Ukraine to its own devices and get included into a military alliance that is showing that their point is not even to try to defend the European security architecture. Their point is just to fight Russia, to provoke it into the same exact kind of war that, unfortunately, Putin decided to wage. For various reasons. Good and bad. But to me, mostly good when it comes to the point of view of the Russian security and sovereign interests. I'm going to tell you, purely on a security level, both sides are having the right mindset. Of course, for Ukraine, it's better to be allied with a big dog like NATO to avoid getting attacked. It just didn't went fast enough for them. And for Russia, of course, it is better to see Ukraine burn to ashes instead of having it as a launchpad for the historical every century attack into Russia. This is why international relationships are so fucking insane, is that everybody needs to think for its own interest, even if those two interests are mutually exclusive and will lead to fight. The whole friendship bullshit doesn't exist. Once you see it that way, once you see things on a security point of view, which often is extremely problematic, then it makes sense. But for Russia, it's been at least 5 centuries they have people coming from the West to attack them. Every fucking century there's something. There's someone trying that bullshit. So what? It's not paranoia. It's literally learning from the past. And of course, when you have the means to do what the Russians are doing, you will do it. America is doing it right now, parking a small fleet off Venezuela, killing guys who Maybe are smugglers, maybe not. So that's the thing. So to recap the whole thing, first of all, Russia has now Ukraine to the ropes financially. It has Russia has the Ukraine to the ropes. Goddamn dog. Sorry, guys. Yeah. So Russia has also Ukraine to the ropes intellectually. Ukraine has stopped thinking about any other way to fight Russia on the ground than just getting beaten up and not dying. For various reasons, the fact that people are making money, but also simply because the third point, the attrition is so high that people start making the counts, see that it will go only worse, but in their mind, it's better to give up when it's the worst possible and hope for clemency or pity than give up now and have to account with both sides. So with a very annoyed population, let's call it like this, who demand accounts, and sponsors who will also demand accounts, then, as I said, the situation will be so dear they will be completely at the Russian mercy. And overall, it would make no difference. This was the first part, a bit confusing at the end. It was the first part of the analysis. This one was a bit paradigmatic. I'm not trying to view this as some kind of end-all analysis. It is mostly just to set up the tone for the second part, which would be the tactical aspect and the strategic as well. Once again, as I said, we are entering the money time of the shit show for both sides, and one side is in worse shape. We are not here to talk about, oh, everything is rose, everything is good. But unfortunately, at some point, the side who is in worse shape, who has the biggest problems, will be ending up looking like a proper loser in this race to the bottom. And this is what I want you people to understand. There will be a victory, but it won't be some kind of quick desert. You already know that, by the way. But the point I'm saying that even when finally Ukraine is going to cede, the Russian victory will look extremely bleak for both sides, but far more for Ukraine. And I think that Ukrainians want to go scorched earth on themselves, at least the political leadership, so there wouldn't be much to extract out of them. And in a certain sense, that's why they're doing with the areas they're defending. They are leaving them in a horrible state instead of pulling back and say, okay, we're going to get fucking clapped here. No, they're going to kill enough people in there to make completely nonsensical. They're going to let the whole infrastructure destroyed. They're going to attack even their own. Recently, they attacked the Donetsk TPP. Like, come on, guys. They're supposed to be Ukrainians, and you're just bombing them and putting them cold. And that's the beauty of this, the completely psycho and schizoid aspect of the Ukrainian leadership right now. On one side, they say, oh, Russia has forcibly conscripted Donbas citizens. On the other side, we just bombed a TPP and cut power off Donetsk for at least 2 weeks. That's why that polity as it stands right now needs to disappear. And I hope it will not be called the same way it's called right now. Thank you very much, guys. I know it was long, I know it's a bit complicated and maybe hard to understand at the end, but I need to put the foundations because I think the analysis going forward, especially 2026, are going to be extremely bleak. and I'm going to start also opening up a bit on many aspects that the Russians failed over 2022, 2003. They are paying now in blood, but because Russia is Russia, they're going to make the Ukrainians pay for their failures in 2023. And I hope to be wrong on that one. But the way I see the war going, I think that's going to be the only way forward. And Ukrainians are just going to be spanked for the audacity to do what they did the first 2 years of the war. Thank you very much. I'm not going to take questions today. Most probably with the follow-up, the tactical aspect, I'll take whatever questions, whatever interventions. And the third part will be very brief because it's going to be just objectives. And then if you are up to it, if anyone wants to do it, we're going to have ask me about everything. Thank you very much. Sorry for maybe the confusion at the end, in the sense that it was swerving towards a personal vision of how I saw the war. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.